Josh Swanson, Vogel Law Firm.
Coming to us from his home office down in the deep, deep basement of his home office, of course, on our Bakken Barbecue phone lines here. And Josh Swanson, are you in the deep bowels of your basement there?
I'm in the Swanee Bison Man Cave. I've got my two bulldogs behind me. They're my new associates, and my 6-month-old Maverick. I've been home with him, and he's content right now. So yeah, I'm deep in the basement I got all my paper stacked up, my laptop, my cell, and trying to, do business as best as most of us are, talking to you before the phone call. And I've talked with a lot of attorneys in the oil and gas industry, whether it's from, Hess or wherever this week. And everyone's in the same position, trying to make the best of it they can and still get some work done.
Well, and that's one of the things too is, as far as I know, even if you could get a court date, there's no courts that are really taking cases. I know they're doing some emergency cases, but right now in terms of attorneys, I would imagine you guys are really busy because of the due diligence and contracts and all kinds of different things that comes into the play right now, whether it's contract disputes. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and we'll get to that in just a second, is this force majeure, which I'm seeing a lot of more and more in headlines. I'm not seeing it in application, but I am seeing it in headlines, starting with the NBA is how I'll phrase it. But you guys are staying pretty busy, though, just even with the courts not scheduling dates, you guys are still busy.
Yeah, and the news of Whiting's Chapter 11, when a company takes action like that and files for bankruptcy, there's a lot of other things that are triggered, including an automatic stay and a lot of state pending litigation or even litigation in federal court. So we have clients dealing with that, and a lot of your listeners, wherever they are service providers that have done work, whether it's on wells or pipelines, and there's issues that come up. If there's accounts receivable and folks are needing to get paid, at one point, do they file a lien to make sure they're a secured creditor versus an unsecured creditor? And we've been getting a lot of calls on that from our clients and taking action there, and a lot of contract issues. You're right. In fact, the force majeure clause, I was on a webinar with Baker Donaldson, a big national firm, earlier this week, and that's something that's going to come up, and it is coming up right now. A lot of your listeners have probably heard, another industry, restaurant and dining, the Cheesecake Factory in late March, sent a letter to all their landlords into malls saying that they're not going to pay rent starting in April because of the COVID-19 crisis. And there are a lot of force majeure issues at play, and I'm real glad to talk to you, legal nerd that I am. I actually did a law review article for the UND Law Journal back in 2014 called The Hand of God, limiting the impact of the force majeure clause in an oil and gas lease. So I've looked through that a couple times, and you're absolutely right. Those cases have already started to make their way through the court system. So it's something we're keeping an eye on. It's something that our clients are very, very aware of. And if listeners out there have agreements with the force majeure clause, what they ought to do right away, if they haven't already, is take a look at those, because I know the force majeure language that I draft for clients, that's whether it's in an oil and gas contract or anything else, we require that the party claiming force majeure sends written notice, whether it's within 5 days, 10 days, or 14 days, to the other party of the contract saying, we're hereby notifying you that we're exercising our rights under section 1.15 of the contract, declaring a force majeure event. And if you don't do that, even if there is a force majeure event, it's a creature of contract, and that's what the case law says, that force majeure is what the contract says it is. And in some cases it'll need to be interpreted by the courts, but if your contract says you need to let the other party to the agreement know within 14 days that there's a force majeure event, if you don't do that, whether or not there's a force majeure event doesn't matter, because you've breached or failed to exercise that specific requirement in the contract. So it's a really really great topic and something that your listeners and our clients are very, very aware of or should be aware of.
Well, in force majeure, of course, act of God, but it also goes into other areas of pandemic, epidemic, those types of things. So just kind of give a very brief definition of force majeure, because one of the reasons, of course, I'm very attuned to it is because I come from, the upper Midwest where we flood every year. So I do see that term every now and then during flooding seasons, but it's never been a flood of them on the internet like I've seen with the current state of affairs.
Yeah, and I'll read you an example of a force majeure clause that I typically use or ask for revisions to in an oil and gas contract. Quote, this lease shall not be terminated nor lessee held liable in damages if compliance with covenants in this lease is prevented or hindered by an act of God, of the public enemy, adverse field, weather or market conditions, labor disputes, inability to obtain materials in the open market or transportation thereof, inability to obtain governmental permits or approvals necessary to lessee's operations, such circumstances of events being hereafter referred to as force majeure. Lessee shall notify lessor in writing within 15 days of the first occurrence of any claimed events defined herein, which prevents or hinders any compliance. Such notice required in order for said events to qualify as force majeure. Okay, layman's terms, what does that mean? If there's an act in the contract beyond a party's control, and there's a couple of requirements there that are in the case law, and folks can, they're welcome to go read my law review article, The Hand of God, Limiting the Impact of the Force Majeure Clause. Shameless self-plug there for that. But basically, it's an event that's beyond the party's control that prohibits them from complying with the contract and state or federal governmental orders. In the Akuma case from New York that dealt with the moratorium there on fracking and horizontal drilling, there's been some cases in North Dakota on it, but there's a couple requirements. One is that you can't perform your end of the agreement because of something beyond your control, and what is beyond your control is typically defined by the contract. Another issue is foreseeability. Courts have asked, and on this same webinar that I was on with these other attorneys earlier in the week, one of the key questions we're going to see out of the force majeure clause is with regards to COVID-19, when were the contracts entered? When was performance rendered impossible? And was that foreseeable? So at what point does the foreseeability with the virus become an issue? When it starts wreaking all kinds of havoc in Wuhan back in January, when there's the first reports to our intelligence agencies that have been making the rounds around the papers. So that'll be a factual question for the court, and different judges are going to see that differently. So I don't know if litigants will be form shopping a little bit, trying to find the right judge that might be most sympathetic to their clause, because some of the clauses, I was looking through a master services agreement for a client this morning that specifically says that epidemics are covered by force majeure. But the problem there that I'm foreseeing for the adverse party on our side is they never exercise written notice. So even if epidemics are covered, and they are by some of them, there are some factual considerations that a party needs to be aware of. And a court is going to say, it might sound a little callous, and there are issues impacting every business right now in the economy, whether it's oil and gas, restaurant, retail, bars, obviously healthcare. But the courts are going to defer to what the contract says. And that's what the case law, the one consistency in the force majeure case law is. It's a creature of contract, and the parties can set their rights and obligations vis-a-vis one another by the contract. So even if it seems unfair or inequitable, if the contract dictates what it is, that's what's going to control. So it's a real interesting legal question, and obviously for business purposes, people out there listening need to go take a look at contracts they have right now and see what their contract says about the force majeure clause, because we've seen it back in, you mentioned the flooding back in around 2011 when Minot just got hammered. Letters went out from the Industrial Commission to operators saying you better berm your well site so there's no overland flooding and contamination, etc. So it's something that we've seen before with flooding and weather. but not in this context on such a wide scale.
I did want to ask you about parsing some words. Obviously, this is where you attorneys make your money. So, parsing words and that sort of thing. You like that joke? Had to throw it in there. But, this is serious, though, with the word epidemic and pandemic. How much can these terms get parsed, I guess, get interpreted, reinterpreted? I guess I'm hope I'm using the word parse correctly, but it seems like the term epidemic and pandemic could trigger or get caught up on some things.
And that's a really good question, Jason, especially when you take a look at, for example, when did the World Health Organization and CDC declare COVID-19 to be a pandemic? Is that an event that, officially under the contract triggers it because that's when it was declared a pandemic versus before that when it was spreading throughout parts of Asia? So that's a really good question, and that is where lawyers make their money as to when do these events occur. And I think, if I'm arguing it, I don't know that I would try to tell the court, well, this wasn't a pandemic or epidemic, Your Honor. I might argue the timeline. In fact, that's what I would probably focus on, depending on the client and the contract, is when did the party have knowledge of the force majeure event being the pandemic, and when was it actually a pandemic or foreseeable? So I think the other end of it that's important too is that if you're a party to a contract with force majeure language, to reach out to the other side, because there's nothing that says, typically when we have a dispute, unless there's certain statutory timelines at play, we don't go rushing to the courthouse right away to file a lawsuit. We reach out to the other party and we try to work through it and say, hey, look, I know I can't comply with this contract. This thing is kicking everyone's butt. We know that we got to pay some money. Let's talk about a payment plan, or let's talk about an agreement, because it's, better to get 50 cents on a dollar right now and then get paid the rest at a later date when this all subsides, than for one party to say what we're probably going to see a lot of companies filing for bankruptcy here. So there's different issues at play with that. But the key thing is, one, you can try to work it out with the other side to the agreement. And I think, Cheesecake Factory, they're doing that as an example, because they're as far as I know, one of the bigger businesses out there that's told landlords, hey, we can't pay right now. So if you're the landlord, what's the alternative? You force Cheesecake Factory into bankruptcy, and then who's going to rent the lease space right now at those retail locations? Well, nobody is going to do it. So there's a lot of, you're a guy that understands business, Jason. So there's a lot of practical implications too, where as a lawyer, I would tell my clients, this is how it could play out. And there really are no good solutions and no good answers. And that's the one thing with this COVID-19 thing. There's really no good example for litigators, for folks in the media, in politics, and even the law. When a judge has to make this decision, there's really no good example. We've talked about it before. What lawyers do is governed by precedent, by previous cases. Judges look to that when interpreting whether it's a contract, language, statutes, rules, regulations, etc. There's really nothing for a judge to go back to, or as a litigator to tell them, well, judge, go look at the, Spanish flu, influenza that went through in 1919 post-World War I. Well, that was 100 years ago type of thing, and there's really nothing even remotely close to compare it to. So from a legal perspective, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think parties out there, the time to act is right now to protect their interests if they're dealing with a force majeure or they can't perform under the terms of an agreement or a contract.
I was talking with an attorney down in Houston, Texas, Chris Cottrell out of Winston-Strom, and he actually called out the Texas Railroad Commission and said, when we talked about the pandemic and the epidemic phrasing and the language, he called out and recommended that the Texas Railroad Commission should actually step forward and get proactive on this and put out a definition or something along those lines. And what I thought of is like what Governor Burgum just did in North Dakota, where you declare an emergency declaration. Of course, again, with flooding, this is very common in the state. Is there anything from the government side, or maybe Lynn Helms, the director of mineral resources, or the Industrial Commission, for them to come out and say, that North Dakota is officially declaring this a pandemic, and the reason we're doing that is so that future court cases can, compare it when it comes to that point versus, do you know what I mean? As far as get ahead of the verbiage, I guess.
They absolutely should. And what might seem counterintuitive to listeners, right now, operators aren't prohibited from going out and working the well sites, from servicing them, and from keeping the wells going. Now, from a force majeure perspective, that's a problem because there's no governmental guidance, order, or rule saying their performance is prohibited, so they can still perform under the terms of the contracts, which might be counterintuitive because to exercise and get the protections of that, there's really nothing out there now prohibiting them from doing their work. And if I'm on the flip side of it and I'm arguing for a mineral owner or somebody in a service contract, that's exactly what I'd say is there's no governmental, there's no shelter in place, for example, that's applicable to the oil and gas industry. And I know a lot of folks in the industry, I mean, we need oil and gas. I mean, there's obviously too much of a supply right now, which is part of the problem. But there's different issues that come along with shutting wells in, expenses with that, cash flow, etc. But so long as those operators can keep those wells going, performance isn't rendered impossible under a governmental rule, order, or regulation. And what the case law says in those sorts of situations, force majeure doesn't apply. I mean, there's another concept known as the defense of impossibility, where a party could argue, well, okay, force majeure might not apply, but under the common law, there's this implied defense. And if my performance is rendered impossible by an act beyond my control, that's an argument. But again, I would argue, well, it's not impossible because, company X, Y, and Z, their wells are going, and I can pull up a well and say, well, geez, this one pumped 6,000 barrels last month. So I think that the state of North Dakota and the Industrial Commission, the attorney you were talking to, I think that thinking is really smart. I think they should try to get ahead of this. If I'm a oil company, they've got a lot of stuff going on, obviously, right now with the markets and cash flow, getting bills paid, trying to remain solvent. I would send a letter out to mineral owners saying this is a tough time for everybody. We ask that you work with us, be patient, that kind of thing. We're doing the best we can to fulfill agreements, etc. At this time, we're, not canceling any contracts. We don't think we're in breach. But in North Dakota, and I've told other operators this, sometimes just being up front with the mineral owner and not being a jackass about something and answering the phone call, that solves a lot of problems, and it can stave off a lot of litigation. I think the problem a lot of companies get into, even with the mineral owner that might only own, a couple hundred acres or might only own, 50 acres, is that companies are non-responsive and they can't get a response. And then they feel their only recourse is calling a guy like me. And, like I said, we try to work things out, but I think it's in the interests of the operators, the mineral owners, and everyone involved. A couple things. Nobody likes seeing oil at $20 a barrel. And it's pretty scary. The same call I was on earlier in the weekend, an attorney there said it wouldn't surprise him if oil went negative, just like natural gas did. That's scary for everybody. Nobody wants that because in addition to mineral owners not getting their checks, it impacts a lot of workers. It impacts a lot of guys that you and I know, and it's not good for the state. It's not good for tax collection. It's not good for revenue. So everybody wants to see this thing get better before it gets worse. And I would suspect, I would think, there's some pretty smart folks working at the Industrial Commission and in their oil and gas division that they would issue some sort of guidance coming up or work with the governor's office to do that, to even declare a state of emergency there to maybe provide some sort of backstop or firewall that would help out in some of these contractual disputes and disagreements. That it's not a question of if they're going to come up, it's a question of when they're going to come up.
You've been following the Whiting bankruptcy filing?
Oh, yeah.
So,
that's a...
this is not, this isn't anything new, I guess, shocking to a lot of people when we really take a step back. A third of the workforce was laid off last July. What was it, $1.2 billion in debt was posted around November, public company, and then of course the recent filing. Just kind of give me your legal attorney overview of the Whiting filing, that sort of thing.
And I'll start by giving a lawyer type disclaimer. I'm not a bankruptcy debtor creditor attorney. We do have those at Vogel, and I work closely with them on contract cases that involve those kind of issues. Having said that, I suppose the good news is it's a Chapter 11, which means they're trying to restructure. They're not liquidating the company, as far as I know and what I've seen and read. They're going to keep the wells going because they need cash coming in. They need assets. And I think, if I'm remembering right, their assets right now exceed their liabilities. And I don't know if it's on a 2-to-1 ratio. I can't remember what I was reading yesterday about it. So, they need to pay off their creditors and lenders. One of the big issues is talking to attorneys who know a lot more about this than I do, is that the oil and gas game is a real cash intensive business. There's a lot of capital. These wells aren't cheap. They cost many, many millions of dollars. And the issue that's coming up that a lot of operators are going to be facing, from what it sounds like, is when they need to tap into those credit lines or get financing, lenders are going to say, we can't do it right now. I think that's probably where some of the issues coming up, or discussions being had right now, I'm sure, at oil and gas offices across the country, whether it's big time operators like Whiting or the small independent ones, are, if we need to get financing or cash, where can we get it? And where can we, a lot of these operators, it as well as anybody, Jason, they were trimming their belts and cutting costs and trying to be as efficient as possible. And this COVID-19 thing and the dispute between the Russians and Saudis and OPEC, it could not have come at a worse time. I mean, you talk about the worst time for all of this to hit this industry, it was right now. So not only are you trying to battle the stuff beyond your control with the Russians and Saudis and them flooding the market, okay, now all of a sudden people aren't driving. And even airlines, a big source of fuel, they're not flying near as many planes. So you don't have that demand there, and things are pumping. And pretty soon, I know, talking to this other attorney in Louisiana, one of their senators, I think Cassidy down there, was trying to push through getting the United States to buy up oil and gas to put into the strategic reserve with where price is at right now. And a problem that we're going to start seeing pretty quick is they're going to run out of storage space to put it once they pump it, and that's not good for anybody. So with the Whiting situation, the real unfortunate thing about it, talking to other folks in the industry, is that they're might be the first, but they're certainly probably not the last. And when will this thing get better is a question that nobody can answer. And when folks like you and me are sitting at home, aren't driving, aren't traveling, that puts a big ding in demand, and summer travel season's coming up. So, I hope and pray, I really do, that for the sake of everybody, this thing's, we all want it to be over sooner rather than later. But the real scary thing is, we were talking before the call, this could fundamentally alter the economy as we know it, and have a real, it's not a question of how it's going to impact our lives and market. It's a question of how severe it'll be. And is this a 1-year thing, a 2-year thing? The Great Recession back in 2008 with the housing crisis and the financial markets, took a couple of years to bounce back from that. You look at the Great Depression, it was really World War II that finally pulled us out of the doldrums for that. And those are situations where, again, I would really hope our leaders in Congress and at the state level are having those discussions now and trying to come up with a plan. Because if you try to shoestring this thing together, and at a certain point, you just can't keep doing a phase 3 and a phase 4 and a phase 5 where you're doling out trillions and trillions at a time. So in the short term, I think folks are trying the best they can to get through it, and Whiting, hopefully they get on more solid footing and they can keep on going. But man, brother, it's a really uncertain and frankly scary time for a lot of people.
No, I think your example of probably the Great Depression is the only realistic comparison that you could probably make with this, and even that's not applicable. This is a global recession, and it is all connected. And it just so happens that we pretty much all use the same bartering system. So We have a very good connectivity with the internet. We've got a bartering system that seems to be somewhat universal. There's a lot of difference. The one thing that is the same, though, and the reason I say that the Great Depression is probably a good comparison is not only was the Great Depression countrywide in terms of the masses, the other, the other recessions were a little bit more pocket oriented, and this industry was affected more than this industry and everything along those lines. The Great Depression, like this one, it's pretty much universal. Outside of a very select few industries, even like you take oil and gas, there's some companies are doing really well because we're still pumping, but most are not. Healthcare, same thing. A lot of them are doing really well, but some are not. Is that the thing that I think is there's a paradigm shift of a technology disruptor that is going to carry us through, much like the Depression did. And the Depression, you had not only the advent of communication, whether it be radio and television, but you also had more of automobiles and kind of that motor engine that really carried us through as well. And I see that the internet is going to be like that. And I also see that the universal bartering system is going to be very similar to that too. Because really, it is. Like you and I were talking earlier. I mean, just the fact that restaurants, just that industry may never be the same. And
And that's such a great point. When you make the Great Depression comparison, one of the things that happened afterwards is folks saved more. They were less inclined to spend, less inclined to make the big ticket purchases, less inclined to take on credit and pile up debt. And I think that's something that we'll see here after this situation plays out, is folks are going to be a lot more fiscally conservative. They're going to save more. They're going to spend less until they know for certain we're on sure footing. And that really didn't happen in the United States until post-World War II, when you had the baby boomers and the GIs getting back, and they started building houses and going back to school. And then we really had an economic explosion under Eisenhower and into the 60s that, the economy really took off after that. But it was really post-World War II until our economy really took off again. So I think that thinking is spot on, and everything I've read out there from Bloomberg to CNBC to Fox Business, you're hearing a lot of stuff like that. That this is, I think, the term you use that's very apropos. There will be a paradigm shift, no question about it. And you just think about it, folks going, to restaurants and bars after this. Now, some are going to want to run to, whether it's Chubb's Pub or wherever in Fargo, and have a beer, but folks going out to the, whether it's the Mezzalunas of the world or Mackenzie River or whatever, they'll probably be less inclined to do that because we won't know when we'll be out of this. And if we are in a recession, people are going to be less inclined to spend money. So what happens to those workers? Well, what happens to the workers at the factories and plants? And the whole trickle-down effect, we'll see how it shakes out. But we've all seen the unemployment numbers, and the Department of Labor's jobs report comes out today. So when you talk about paradigm shift, the Great Depression is probably the closest thing to compare it to. And obviously we don't want to see bread lines or anything like we did there. But when you talk about, I know a lot of listeners and a lot of folks in the upper Midwest tend to like government staying out of their business. The government, especially the federal government and even the state governments, are going to have a more likely to have a more expansive role in stuff like that than they've had at any other time, going back to when, government started kind of rolling back on the welfare state and regulations in the 80s. So the term paradigm shift is absolutely spot on.
I mean, I'm already seeing things like where you need a vaccine card to travel, and people only get a certain amount of travel credits a year, and they can sell them on the open market. I mean, because right now everything's on the table. And people are arguing and trying to logically come up with reasons to take it off the table. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, Josh, real quick, is the paradigm shift is with the education system. Is when the education system during that Great Depression, it changed during that time a little bit. Not much, but it changed a little bit, primarily because there was an in-migration of rural going into cities. So you still had the agrarian 9-month education system in place. However, there was a lot more urban, and that changed the dynamic of education as well. Okay, and that is now happening with the internet and with distance learning, they call it. So what you're seeing now is you're going to see some distance learning change the paradigm of how we operate as a society, because if your kids are not going to school every day, well, that's going to change how people are going to be at home. So that's another reason I bring up the Great Depression too, is that we had that kind of that transition from agriculture to more urbanization during that period of time, which shifted a little bit of the education. Now, keep in mind, the education system, if Rip Van Winkle woke up from his 100-year slumber, the education system would be about the only thing that he would recognize. So it is due for a little bit of a change, Josh.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up. My wife and I were having this same conversation last night with parents and kids being at home doing the learning through GoToMeeting or Skype or whatever video conferencing platform they're using. How likely are we to see that in the near future going forward? And not just education, but working from home, where employers might be more willing to let employees work from home, and then you cut down on the big expenses as far as building and space you need for that. So do we see that? That's a really good question. When you take a look at the expense in education, I'm a big proponent of education at all levels. I think it's one of the things that the United States does really better than anybody in the world, is giving our citizens access to really good education and giving them an opportunity, whether you're a farm kid from Maddock, North Dakota, or a country club kid from Minneapolis. If you work hard and show merit, you can get a high level education in this country. But our schools and the education system would be more inclined to let kids do the learning where they stay at home. So it's kind of homeschooling, but on a public level, where you're doing the video conferencing, then you don't need as much space. So you think about it, and not to get too futuristic on us, but I think it's a really fascinating discussion. You look at the classroom crunch and space issues that have come up in Western North Dakota districts with the influx of people and having to do classes like they did in Watford City for a while, and trailers, and the different votes that have come up, like in Williston for expanding the school or doing some building. Is this an option now where kids are going to learn at home, online, doing the video conferencing with their teachers? And if that happens, schools have been providing social services and lunches and things like that for kids who, come from homes where they need it, beyond anything the kids have any control in. But I think one of the areas that will be impacted will be education. And the schools now, most of them staying closed through year end. If this works, where kids are learning and they're learning through online and tech platforms, is that a new option for some of these districts in rural North Dakota where schools are closing? I mean, think about that, Jason. You see all these school consolidations and closures, and trying to get good teachers in areas of not just rural North Dakota, but rural America. I know Governor Burgum's been big into pushing broadband access for rural North Dakota, which I think is critically important. Is that a new option there, where you might not have a school in, Maddock or Leeds or McCluskey or wherever? Now you have kids that can, whether it's getting a laptop or tablet from the state, and they can log on wireless and watch instruction, whether the teachers in Bismarck or Minot. Now, I understand, I'm friends with a lot of teachers. I think there's a huge value to having kids in a classroom from learning and from socialization and everything like that. But is that something that's on the table now going forward? So, kind of tying it all together, when you talk about a paradigm shift, that this is going to impact all areas of our lives, not just the economy, but education and even healthcare. And we've seen that in rural North Dakota, the telemedicine things. And I know Maddock is at telemedicine for probably 15 to 20 years now with the business and tech center we have there. But one of the stories that's real big during the COVID-19 crisis is rural hospitals closing and the lack of services, and the ability for folks to do telemedicine and getting healthcare like that. And I know with the COVID-19, they need to be coming into the big hospitals, but the technology now, fortunately, thank God, Jason, our country has the ability, unlike a lot of other countries, where we can do education and kids can go to school online. And our economy, some of the third world countries and oil and gas producers and developers that are really taking it in the shorts right now, their technology and their use of it isn't as widespread and comprehensive as ours. So if there's one thing right now that saved, this situation, I mean, hell, we could be in a Great Depression right now, like our great grandparents and grandparents were back in the late 20s and 1930s, but for technology. That's the one area that's probably kept our heads above water. And I know they're talking 13, 15% unemployment, and the numbers are really jaw dropping. But can you imagine how bad it would be without technology right now?
I did want to mention to you too, the one thing about the education side is, a lot of people are talking about the remote distancing and the utilization of the technology. But the one thing I've noticed is I think it's really illustrated and really shined a light how those K through 6 kids need the social interaction. You start getting into junior high and you start getting into high school and even the colleges. I get where you can become a little more independent and you can, almost get to a syllabus type thing. But there's such an importance during that, during that youth and adolescence to have the kids be socially interactive. I hope that's not lost, because I think it's pretty easy to, take a look at the technology. Do you know what I mean by that, Josh?
Yeah, and I think an example that comes to mind, I think about my 10-year-old nephew who plays youth baseball, and I think about myself and my brother and our buddies growing up in Maddock playing football and basketball and baseball and track. One of the first places that the youth of our country really learned how to work and behave in a team environment is growing up playing sports, playing the T-balls, playing basketball and interacting with other kids, right? So I hope that isn't lost, and it's a real tough time to be a parent right now. I mean, I know you're a parent, I'm a parent, and we worry about our kids, and we want our kids to be able to go outside, to go to the playground and play. And I feel terrible for my niece and nephews who are cooped up inside right now. My son's 6 months old, so he doesn't have a real solid understanding of what's going on because he's 6 months old. But kids that are in elementary school, and all of a sudden they're in home for how long they can't go play with their friends or buddies, and what are we going to lose with that? So I think that'll be one of the stories from a mental health side to pay close attention to, making sure that our kids are doing, not just kids, all of us are doing all right. I know, one of the things I've done with my buddies through one of the video chat platforms, we've had virtual happy hours where, because Monday or Tuesday this week, from like 4 to 5:30, there was 4 of us on a video conference, and we knocked back a couple cold ones. And last Friday, I did the same thing with the 4 or 5 other buddies. Just sat upstairs and had a couple Sam Adams while talking to them. And even as grown-ups, one of the things Governor Cuomo had mentioned that I caught in the background, I think last week, is as human beings, we're wired to be part of a community. We're wired to need that social interaction with other people, and we've been wired like that for since the beginning of man, going back to Neanderthals and caveman and everything like that, sitting around a fire. I mean, just think about even now how sitting around a fire brings people together, and when you lose that or cut it off, when all of us have to stay at home, I mean, that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. So I think something, and not to get too far afield, but something I would tell your listeners, and I've told the listeners on the Bison Illustrated podcast, I mean, things just interacting with other people, getting on a video conference, whether it's, having your kids talk to their buddies or their grandparents, or even for us adults, having something like a virtual happy hour. I mean, from a mental health perspective, I know for me, sitting at home working all day, that's been something that's really helped me out. And I was surprised, in fact, how much it has helped me out with, my wife being in the healthcare field and working at the cancer center here in Fargo. She has to go to work, and I'm sitting working from home. So just talking with other people is something that's really important, whether you're an adult or whether you're in 5th or 6th grade, trying to, figure out how to adjust and hang out with your buddies.
Well, that's the thing, man. There's still a lot to be happy about out there. There's more ways to communicate with people. There's, different ways to utilize technology to your advantage in today's day and age. And in the world of business, I try to tell people that it is difficult right now. I get that. But at the end of the day, there's still the same amount of, there's more money out there than ever before. So it's just, less people have it. So you got to figure out how to build a better mousetrap, how to have, a better steak sandwich and that type of thing. And there is still opportunity out there. Right now, the opportunity is very small and the opportunity is very niche, and you just got to find what that is. Your business, though, is one of those that's going to keep going. So talk to us about how you make some money, how you are, keeping your name out there during this time, so people can get in touch with you if they need some work done during this time of. I call it a great time to get some due diligence done. I mean, you can't find a better time to get due diligence than now.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You've got to work, even in our line of business where work's coming in. You got to be out there pounding the pavement. You got to be talking to your clients and letting them know what kind of services that you have. And contract law is a big one right now. And even something, not to sound too dark or macabre, but estate planning is a situation where we've been maybe a little surprised as attorneys how many folks want to get healthcare directives in place or to update wills or do estate planning. And even for things, the federal legislation that's come out, we've advised a lot of our business clients that are employers about that and how they can take advantage of the federal legislation. And there's tax issues that come up, and how does that impact the filing that you're doing, whether it's an individual or a business. So we're offering a full range of services like we always have. We're working remotely, which is challenging, but with the cell phones and laptops, I'm still getting my hours in and able to connect with my clients. But I tell your listeners, check out the Vogel Law firm. Just Google us, vogellaw.com, and they can look at our website. We've got a lot. If you click on the blogs tab at the top of the page, we got a lot of articles that we've been putting out in the last couple of weeks talking about what folks should be looking at for services. So they're welcome to do that, and they can always give us a call. We've got our staff. Fortunately, throughout all this, we've been able to keep the vast majority of our staff on, keep them busy, keep them working to make sure they're getting a paycheck. So if your listeners call 701-237-6938, it's 237-6938, they can talk to one of our staffers and get routed to where they need to go. And we'd be happy to help them tackle whatever legal issue that they're facing.